Hello there and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist. Tonight, we're diving beneath the surface of the ocean to explore one of Earth's most extraordinary wonders, coral reefs. These underwater cities of color and life have been growing for millions of years, sheltering countless species and protecting our coastlines. They're built by creatures so small, you might miss them, yet they create structures visible from space. Coral reefs are gardens and fortresses, nurseries and pharmacies, ancient archives and fragile warnings. As you settle in, let your mind drift down through warm turquoise waters, past schools of shimmering fish, into a world where every surface pulses with life. We'll explore how these living cathedrals form, why they glow with color, what threatens them, and why their survival matters to every human on this planet. It's a story of symbiosis and survival, of beauty and vulnerability, of hope and urgency. And just before we begin, if these calm, curious explorations help you unwind or give you a quiet way to end your day, consider liking and subscribing to the channel. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. What exactly is a coral reef? Think about what a city is, not just buildings, but the life within them, the connections between inhabitants, the systems that sustain everything. The coral reef is much the same. At first glance, it might look like an underwater rock garden, colorful and static, but look closer. Every surface is alive. A coral reef is a massive structure built by tiny animals called coral polyps, each no bigger than a fingernail, working together over centuries to create calcium carbonate skeletons. These skeletons accumulate into enormous formations, walls, towers, valleys, and caves. The living tissue of the polyps coats the surface, while the skeletal remains of countless generations form the structure beneath. But the reef is far more than just coral. It's an ecosystem, a habitat supporting thousands of species: fish, crustaceans, mollusks, sponges, algae, and creatures we're still discovering. The reef provides food, shelter, and breeding grounds. It's a three-dimensional maze where predators hunt, prey hide, and partnerships form. Coral reefs occupy less than 1% of the ocean floor, yet they support about 25% of all marine species. They're biodiversity hotspots, underwater metropolises, where life flourishes in staggering variety and abundance. When you see a coral reef, you're seeing the work of billions of tiny architects, millions of years of construction, and a living community as complex as any rainforest. Are corals animals, plants, or rocks? Here's something that surprises many people. Corals are animals. Specifically, they belong to the phylum Cnidaria, making them relatives of jellyfish and sea anemones. Each coral colony is composed of thousands of individual polyps, soft-bodied creatures with a cylindrical body topped by a ring of tentacles surrounding a mouth. The polyps are carnivorous, using their tentacles to capture tiny plankton and organic particles drifting in the water. Stinging cells called nematocysts on the tentacles help paralyze prey. But here's where it gets interesting. While corals are animals, they don't live alone. Inside their tissues live microscopic algae called zooxanthella, single-celled plants that photosynthesize, converting sunlight into energy. The algae provide up to 90% of the coral's nutrition, while the coral provides the algae with a protected home and access to sunlight. This partnership is called symbiosis, and it's fundamental to reef-building corals' success. The rocky appearance comes from the calcium carbonate skeleton that each polyp secretes beneath itself. Over time, these skeletons accumulate into the massive structures we recognize as reefs. So corals are animals that farm plants and build rock cities, a triple identity that makes them one of nature's most remarkable collaborations. Understanding this complexity is the first step in understanding how fragile and precious they are, and why their survival requires such specific conditions to be maintained. How did coral reefs first form on Earth? Let's go back in time, hundreds of millions of years, to when Earth's oceans were vastly different. The first coral-like organisms appeared during the Cambrian period, over 500 million years ago. Though they weren't quite like modern corals, true reef-building corals, the ones that construct the massive calcium carbonate structures we know today, evolved during the Triassic period, around 240 million years ago. These ancient corals also formed symbiotic relationships with photosynthetic algae, just as modern corals do. The relationship was revolutionary. By partnering with algae, corals could grow much faster, building reefs on a scale previously impossible. Over millions of years, coral reefs have gone through cycles of expansion and collapse, responding to changing sea levels, temperatures, and ocean chemistry. Mass extinction events wiped out entire reef ecosystems, only for new coral species to evolve and rebuild. The reefs we see today are the latest iteration in this long history. Some modern reef structures, like the Great Barrier Reef, began forming thousands of years ago, growing on the foundations of even older reefs. Each reef is a living monument to deep time, a structure built layer by layer across centuries, connected to an ancient lineage that stretches back through Earth's history. When you touch a coral, you're touching the latest chapter in a story that began long before dinosaurs walked the Earth, a story of adaptation, survival, and the power of cooperation between different forms of life. How do tiny corals build massive structures? Think about the scale we're discussing. Individual coral polyps are small, often just a few millimeters across. Yet colonies of these tiny creatures build the Great Barrier Reef, a structure spanning over 2,300 kilometers, visible from space. How? The answer lies in time, cooperation, and chemistry. Each polyp secretes calcium carbonate, limestone, extracted from dissolved minerals in seawater. The polyp builds a cup-shaped skeleton around itself, a protective home attached to the substrate below. When the polyp reproduces asexually, budding off new polyps, each new individual builds its own skeleton, connected to the parents. Over time, the colony grows, sometimes branching like a tree, sometimes forming massive boulder shapes, sometimes creating delicate plates. As polyps die, their skeletons remain, becoming the foundation for new growth. Generation after generation, layer upon layer, the reef accumulates. The growth is slow. Some corals add just a few millimeters per year, others perhaps a few centimeters. But given enough time, slow accumulation becomes massive structure. A single coral colony might live for centuries. The reef structure beneath might represent thousands of years of continuous growth. Environmental conditions affect growth rates. Warmer waters, optimal sunlight, clean water, and abundant nutrients all help corals build faster. The reef's architecture creates habitat complexity, caves, crevices, overhangs, channels that supports incredible biodiversity. These tiny architects, working together and building continuously, create some of the largest living structures on Earth, testament to the power of incremental effort sustained over time. What makes coral reefs so colorful? Here's where science meets art. The vibrant colors of coral reefs, electric blues, brilliant purples, vivid greens, hot pinks, come from several sources. Much of the color comes from the zooxanthellae algae, living in coral tissue. These microscopic plants contain pigments for photosynthesis, and different species have different colors. But corals also produce their own pigments, called fluorescent proteins, which can be green, red, blue, or purple. These proteins might serve several functions. Some scientists think they act as sunscreens, protecting the coral and its algae from excessive ultraviolet radiation in shallow, bright waters. Others believe they might help distribute light to the algae, improving photosynthesis efficiency. In deeper waters, some fluorescent proteins might even amplify the limited light available, glowing to provide the algae with more photons to work with. The variety of coral species, each with different algae and pigments, creates a palette of extraordinary richness. Add to this the colorful fish, sea stars, sponges, and other reef inhabitants, and you have an underwater landscape more vivid than any garden. But there's poignancy here. Healthy corals are colorful. When corals bleach, expelling their algae under stress, they turn ghostly white, revealing the pale skeleton beneath. Color in a reef is a sign of health, a visual indicator that the symbiosis is functioning, that life is flourishing. When the colors fade, something is deeply wrong. The reef's beauty isn't just aesthetic, it's biological, a signal we should learn to read. Why do corals glow in the dark? Let's consider one of the reef's most magical phenomena. Some corals don't just reflect light, they generate it through fluorescence. When ultraviolet light or blue light hits certain fluorescent proteins in coral tissue, these proteins absorb the light and re-emit it at longer wavelengths, creating a glow visible to the human eye. Under the right lighting conditions, particularly at dusk or with ultraviolet illumination, reefs can appear to glow with ethereal blues, greens, and reds, like a living constellation. But why would corals evolve this ability? Several theories exist. One suggests that fluorescent proteins help manage light levels, converting harsh ultraviolet radiation into softer wavelengths that the zooxanthella can use for photosynthesis without being damaged. Another proposes that in deeper waters, where red and orange wavelengths can't penetrate, fluorescent proteins convert available blue light into wavelengths the algae need, effectively extending the depth at which the coral can survive. Some scientists think fluorescence might also play a role in attracting prey, with the glow luring small organisms toward the coral's tentacles. Recently, researchers have discovered that corals sometimes produce especially vibrant fluorescent colors when stressed, possibly as a last attempt to protect their algae and encourage them to stay. The glow might be a defense mechanism, a beacon of distress. Whatever the full explanation, bioluminescence and fluorescence turn the reef into something otherworldly at night, a landscape that seems lit from within, reminding us that the ocean holds mysteries and beauty beyond our daily experience. How old can a coral reef get? Think about longevity and deep time. Individual coral colonies can live for centuries. Brain corals in the Caribbean have been dated to over 900 years old. These colonies were already established when medieval castles were being built in Europe. Black corals, which live in deeper waters, can survive for thousands of years, with some specimens estimated at 4,000 years old, making them among the oldest living animals on Earth. But the reef structure itself, the accumulated skeletons beneath the living surface, can be much older. Reef formations can represent thousands of years of continuous growth, with layers of limestone built up generation after generation. The Great Barrier Reef, as we know it today, began forming around 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, after the last ice age ended and sea levels rose. But it grew on top of older reef structures that formed during previous warm periods. Drilling into reef formations reveals layer after layer of fossil coral, a geological record of past climates and ocean conditions. Some ancient reef structures, now exposed on land due to tectonic uplift, are millions of years old, preserved remnants of seas that no longer exist. Modern reefs are relatively young compared to geological time, but they represent the latest chapter in a story that stretches back hundreds of millions of years. This longevity makes their current rapid decline all the more tragic. Ecosystems that took thousands of years to develop are being damaged in mere decades, faster than they can possibly recover. What is the oldest coral reef on the planet? Let's travel to the fossil record. The oldest known coral reef structures date back to the Ordovician period, around 450 million years ago. Though these were built by different coral species than those we see today, many of these ancient reefs are now exposed on land, lifted by tectonic forces, their fossilized remains providing windows into ancient seas. Among living reefs, determining the oldest is complex. Some reefs have existed in their locations for tens of thousands of years, though the living coral on their surfaces is much younger. The Red Sea contains some of the oldest continuous reef systems, with foundations dating back over 100,000 years. Australia's Great Barrier Reef, while famous, is actually relatively young in its current form. Most of its structure is less than 10,000 years old, though it sits on older reef foundations. What's remarkable is that many ancient reefs were destroyed by mass extinction events, yet corals recovered and rebuilt. The Permian-Triassic extinction, 252 million years ago, wiped out most coral species, and reefs didn't fully recover for millions of years. The end Cretaceous extinction that killed the dinosaurs also devastated reefs. Yet corals persisted, evolved, and eventually built new reef ecosystems. Today's reefs are survivors of multiple catastrophes, testament to life's resilience. But past recoveries took millions of years, timescales irrelevant to human civilization. The question facing us now is whether we're causing another reef collapse, and whether we'll be around to see any recovery, or whether we care enough to prevent the collapse in the first place. How fast do coral reefs grow? Here's where patience becomes tangible. Coral growth rates vary enormously, depending on species, location, and conditions. Fast-growing branching corals, like staghorn or elkhorn coral, might grow 10 to 20 centimeters per year under ideal conditions. These corals prioritize speed over density, creating delicate, tree-like structures that quickly colonize space, but are fragile and easily damaged. Massive boulder corals, like brain corals or star corals, grow much more slowly, perhaps only a few millimeters to a couple of centimeters per year. But they're incredibly dense and sturdy, surviving storms that would shatter branching corals. Deep-sea corals grow even more slowly, sometimes adding less than a millimeter per year, which is why some are thousands of years old despite being relatively small. The overall reef structure, the accumulation of countless coral skeletons, grows even more slowly, perhaps a few millimeters per year vertically. Though horizontal expansion can be faster, environmental conditions dramatically affect growth. Warm, clear, nutrient-poor waters in the tropics provide ideal conditions. Pollution, sedimentation, overfishing, and temperature extremes all slow growth or cause tissue loss that exceeds new growth. This slow pace makes reefs incredibly vulnerable. A coral colony, taking decades to grow, can be destroyed by a single storm, fishing net, or bleaching event. Reefs taking centuries to develop can be degraded in years by human impacts. The mismatch between growth rates and damage rates is one reason coral conservation is so urgent. We're harming reefs faster than nature can possibly repair them, creating a deficit that threatens their existence. What lives inside a coral polyp? Think about the intimacy of the coral-algae relationship. Inside the coral polyp's tissue, in cells called gastrodermal cells, live the zooxanthellae, single-celled dinoflagellate algae, typically species from the genus Symbiodinium. These algae are so small that millions can live within a single square centimeter of coral tissue. They reside in a specialized compartment within the coral cells, protected from the ocean environment, but bathed in the coral's body fluids. The algae photosynthesize, using sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water to produce sugars and oxygen. They transfer most of these sugars, up to 90% of what they produce, to the coral host, providing the energy the coral needs to build its skeleton, reproduce, and maintain its tissues. In exchange, the coral provides the algae with a safe home, access to sunlight in shallow waters, and nutrients from the coral's metabolic waste. Nitrogen and phosphorus, compounds the algae need, but that are scarce in tropical waters. It's a remarkably efficient arrangement, a closed nutrient cycle that allows both partners to thrive in otherwise nutrient-poor environments. But the relationship is specific and sensitive. The coral and algae must be compatible, their metabolism synchronized. Temperature stress, pollution, or excessive light can disrupt this balance, causing the coral to expel its algae, the phenomenon called bleaching. Without the algae, the coral is essentially starving, relying only on what it can catch with its tentacles, which is rarely enough. The partnership is both powerful and fragile, a success story of evolution that's now threatened by rapid environmental change. What role does algae play in coral life? Let's expand on this crucial partnership. The zooxanthellae don't just provide food. They fundamentally enable reef-building corals to exist. Without algal photosynthesis providing energy, corals couldn't build skeletons fast enough to create reefs. The algae accelerate calcium carbonate deposition, allowing corals to construct their limestone homes much more quickly. This is why reef-building corals are found primarily in shallow, sunlit waters. They need light for their algae to photosynthesize. The algae also help the coral by consuming some of the coral's waste products, recycling nutrients in an elegant closed loop. During the day, photosynthesis produces oxygen, which the coral uses for respiration. At night, the coral catches plankton with its tentacles, providing both itself and its algae with additional nutrients. The algae's presence also gives corals their color. Healthy corals are golden brown or greenish because of the algae within them. Different coral species can host different types of zooxanthellae, and some corals can even swap algae types, potentially adapting to changing conditions. Some algae types are more heat tolerant, others better at low light conditions. This flexibility might help some corals survive warming waters, though the process is slow and uncertain. The algae are so integral to the coral that we can't really think of them as separate organisms. They're components of a superorganism, the holobiont, which also includes bacteria and other microbes living on and in the coral. Understanding coral health means understanding this entire community, not just the coral animal itself. How do corals and algae work together? Here's the mechanics of their cooperation in more detail. During daylight, the zooxanthellae inside the coral tissue photosynthesize. They take in carbon dioxide from the coral's respiration, along with water, and use solar energy to produce glucose and oxygen. The glucose is immediately transferred to the coral host, providing energy. The oxygen is released and used by both partners. The coral, in turn, produces nitrogen and phosphorus compounds as waste from its metabolism and from digesting captured plankton. These nutrients are absorbed by the algae, which need them to grow and photosynthesize, but couldn't obtain them in sufficient quantities from the surrounding water, which is remarkably poor in nutrients. At night, the coral extends its tentacles and actively feeds, capturing zooplankton and organic particles from the water. This predation supplements the energy from the algae and provides proteins and other nutrients the coral needs. The coral's calcium carbonate skeleton is also part of the partnership. Its porous structure allows water and dissolved gases to circulate, reaching the algae embedded in the tissue that coats the skeleton. The coral must balance providing the algae with enough light while protecting them from excessive UV radiation that could damage them. In shallow waters, corals often produce fluorescent proteins that act as sunscreens, filtering the light that reaches the algae. In deeper waters, other fluorescent proteins might amplify the limited light available, helping the algae photosynthesize more efficiently. This carefully balanced cooperation allows both partners to thrive in an environment where neither could survive as well alone. It's a masterpiece of evolutionary fine-tuning, millions of years in the making, and it's now threatened by human-caused environmental changes happening over just decades. What happens when that partnership breaks? Think about what happens when stress disrupts this delicate balance. When water temperatures rise even a couple of degrees above normal, or when other stressors like pollution or excessive sunlight occur, the symbiosis breaks down. The algae, under stress, begin producing reactive oxygen molecules that damage the coral tissue. The coral, in response, expels the algae, essentially evicting them to protect itself from this damage. This is coral bleaching. Without the brownish or golden algae, the coral's white calcium carbonate skeleton shows through the translucent tissue, giving the coral a ghostly white appearance. The coral isn't dead yet, but it's in trouble. Without its algae, it's lost 90% of its food source. It can still capture plankton with its tentacles, but this is rarely enough to sustain it for long. If conditions return to normal quickly, if water temperatures drop or the stress abates, the coral can reacquire algae, either from the water or from populations that survived inside the tissue. Recovery is possible, though it takes months and leaves the coral weakened and vulnerable. But if the stress persists for weeks or months, the coral starves, tissue degrades, the skeleton becomes exposed, and algae and bacteria begin colonizing the dead skeleton. The coral is gone, leaving only its limestone ghost. What was a colorful living part of the reef becomes a pale monument, a marker of what was lost. Mass bleaching events, affecting huge areas of reef, are becoming more frequent as ocean temperatures rise due to climate change. These events can devastate entire reef systems, killing corals that took decades or centuries to grow, eliminating the foundation of the reef ecosystem. The partnership's breakdown is a warning sign, visible evidence of an ocean in distress. How do coral reefs reproduce? Let's explore the fascinating world of coral reproduction, which occurs in two ways. First, asexual reproduction. Corals can grow by budding, where existing polyps split and create new polyps that remain attached to the colony. This is how colonies expand, each new polyp adding its skeleton to the structure. Some corals also reproduce asexually by fragmentation. A branch breaks off in a storm, settles on the seafloor, and grows into a new colony if conditions are right. This is one way reefs naturally recover from damage. But sexual reproduction is equally important and far more dramatic. Most corals are hermaphrodites, meaning each polyp produces both eggs and sperm once a year, triggered by specific environmental cues: water temperature, lunar cycle, day length. Entire reef regions engage in mass spawning within a narrow window, sometimes just a few nights per year. Corals release millions of eggs and sperm simultaneously into the water. The water becomes a blizzard of pink and orange gamete bundles floating toward the surface. This timing synchronization is crucial. Corals are sessile and can't move to find mates, so they must release gametes when neighbors are doing the same, maximizing the chances of eggs and sperm meeting. Fertilized eggs develop into tiny planktonic larvae called planulae, which drift in the current for days or weeks before settling on suitable substrate and transforming into polyps. Most larvae die, eaten by fish, or carried to unsuitable locations, but those that survive become the next generation, potentially founding new colonies or adding to existing reefs. This reproductive strategy, massive investment in millions of offspring with tiny individual survival chances, is common in marine organisms, a numbers game in a vast, unpredictable ocean. Why do corals spawn all at once? Here's one of nature's most spectacular synchronized events. The mass spawning of corals is one of the most remarkable phenomena in the ocean, a carefully timed event critical to reef survival. But why do corals coordinate so precisely, releasing gametes within the same few hours across vast reef areas? Several reasons. First, synchronization vastly increases fertilization success. If one coral spawns alone, its eggs and sperm are diluted across a huge volume of ocean, unlikely to meet. But if millions of corals spawn simultaneously, the water becomes saturated with gametes, and fertilization rates skyrocket. Second, overwhelming predators with sheer numbers helps more larvae survive. Fish, filter feeders, and other predators certainly feast during spawning, but there are simply too many gametes to eat them all. Predator satiation as survival strategy. Third, timing the spawn to specific lunar phases, water temperatures, and times of day ensures that all participants are physiologically ready. The cues are usually very specific: a certain water temperature reached, a number of days after the full moon, at a particular time after sunset. On Australia's Great Barrier Reef, mass spawning typically occurs in November or December, about a week after the full moon. In the Caribbean, spawning might happen in August or September. The precision is astounding. Scientists can predict spawning to within a few days, sometimes hours. How corals sense these cues and coordinate their timing is still being researched, involving complex interactions between temperature sensors, light receptors, and hormonal signals. The result is one of nature's greatest synchronized performances, billions of individuals acting as one, ensuring the next generation has the best possible chance. What conditions do corals need to survive? Think about the Goldilocks zone. Conditions that must be just right. Reef-building corals are surprisingly fussy about their environment. They need warm water, typically between 23 and 29 degrees Celsius, 73 to 84 Fahrenheit. Water, colder than this, slows their metabolism and skeleton building dramatically. Water, hotter than this stresses them, often causing bleaching. They need shallow water, usually less than 70 meters deep, though most thrive in the top 20 meters, where sunlight is strongest for their algae to photosynthesize. They need clear water. Sediment blocks light and can smother coral polyps. They prefer water that's relatively low in nutrients, which seems counterintuitive until you understand that high nutrients promote algae blooms that can outcompete or smother corals. They need stable salinity, typical ocean salinity, of around 35 parts per thousand. They need hard substrate to attach to, rock, old reef, or something solid, not shifting sand. They're also sensitive to pollution, pesticides, and chemical runoff. Their environmental requirements are quite narrow, which is why coral reefs are found in specific locations, primarily in tropical and subtropical waters between roughly 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude, in areas with clear, stable oceanic conditions. The largest reefs, like the Great Barrier Reef and Caribbean reefs, exist where all these conditions align. This specificity is also why corals are so vulnerable to environmental changes. They evolved over millions of years to thrive in specific conditions, and when those conditions shift even slightly, corals can't simply move or quickly adapt. Their environmental requirements are both their strength, allowing them to build massive reefs in perfect conditions, and their vulnerability, making them sensitive indicators of ocean health and canaries in the coal mine for climate change. Why are coral reefs found in warm, shallow waters? Let's delve deeper into this geographical concentration. Coral reefs dominate tropical waters for specific biological and physical reasons. Warm water is essential because reef-building corals are animals adapted to tropical temperatures. Their metabolism, growth rates, and symbiosis with zooxanthellae all function optimally in warm conditions. Cold water slows everything down, and corals can't build reefs fast enough in cooler temperatures to outpace erosion. Shallow water is critical because the zooxanthellae need sunlight for photosynthesis. Light intensity drops rapidly with depth. By 20 meters, much of the visible light spectrum is absorbed, and by 100 meters, it's mostly dark. Without sufficient light, the algae can't photosynthesize, and the coral loses its primary food source and the turbocharged growth that algae enable. Clear water is vital for the same reason. Sediment suspended in the water blocks light just as effectively as depth does. This is why reefs are rare near river mouths or coasts with high erosion. Clear, low-nutrient water also prevents algal blooms that could compete with corals for space. The warmest, shallowest, clearest waters happen to be in the tropics, in areas away from major rivers and upwelling zones. The meeting of these requirements creates a ring around the Earth's tropical belt, where reef-building corals flourish, the so-called coral triangle in the Indo-Pacific and the Caribbean. Interestingly, these are also regions with relatively low seasonal temperature variation, which corals prefer. Stable, warm, clear, shallow. These conditions define the reef zone, and understanding them helps us predict which areas will be most affected as oceans warm and become more acidic. The reefs are already living near the warm edge of their tolerance. Pushing them further could be catastrophic. Can coral reefs live in deep or cold seas? Here's where we expand our definition. While tropical shallow water reefs are the most famous coral ecosystems, exist in surprisingly diverse environments, including deep and cold waters. Cold water corals, also called deep-sea corals, are species that don't rely on zooxanthella and therefore don't need sunlight. Without algal symbiosis, they grow much more slowly, but they can survive in conditions impossible for tropical corals. Cold water coral species are found in all oceans, from polar to tropical regions, at depths ranging from 40 to over 3,000 meters. They tolerate temperatures from near freezing to about 12 degrees Celsius. Like their shallow water cousins, they build calcium carbonate skeletons and can form extensive reef structures over thousands of years. The largest known cold water coral reef complex is off the coast of Norway, covering an area comparable to a large city. These deep reefs are often dominated by species like Lophelia pertusa, which forms branching colonies. Cold water corals feed exclusively by capturing food from the water, plankton, organic particles, dissolved organic matter, using their tentacles. They require strong currents to bring food to them, which is why they often grow on seamounts, ridges, and other features where currents are enhanced. These deep reefs support diverse communities: fish, crustaceans, mollusks, much like tropical reefs. They're just as important ecologically, but are less well studied because of their inaccessibility. They're also threatened, primarily by bottom trawling fishing gear that can destroy in minutes what took thousands of years to grow. Cold water corals remind us that coral ecosystems are more widespread and varied than the postcard images of tropical reefs suggest, and that threats to coral aren't limited to climate change and warm waters. Human impacts reach even the deepest seas. What are deep-sea corals? Think about life in the darkness. Deep-sea corals occupy a completely different niche from their shallow water relatives. They include several families and growth forms: branching tree-like corals, fan-shaped gorgonians, and massive boulder-forming species. Without sunlight, they've evolved different strategies. They're typically slow-growing, adding perhaps a few millimeters per year, but some are extraordinarily long-lived. Black corals, named for their dark skeletons, can live for over 4,000 years, making them some of Earth's oldest animals. Bamboo corals, with alternating segments of calcified and protein-based skeleton, are common in the deep. These corals feed entirely on what drifts by in the current: zooplankton, marine snow, detritus falling from surface waters, dissolved organic matter. They're filter feeders, catching particles with their polyps. Because food is scarce in the deep ocean, they need almost continuous feeding opportunities, which is why they favor areas with strong currents. Deep-sea coral habitats are often biodiversity hotspots. Fish, including commercially important species like rockfish and orange ruffy, use deep coral as habitat. Crustaceans hide among the branches. Octopuses lay eggs on corals. The three-dimensional structure creates habitat in the otherwise flat abyssal plain. Scientists are discovering new species associated with deep corals regularly. These corals are also archives of ocean history. Their growth rings record past ocean conditions, temperature, and chemistry over centuries, making them valuable for understanding past climate. Yet they're virtually invisible to most people, out of sight and out of mind, even as trawling nets destroy them. Understanding deep-sea corals is essential for managing ocean health, even though we're only beginning to explore these dark realms where corals have been growing, unnoticed, for millennia. How do coral reefs support so much life? Let's consider the reef as an ecosystem engine. Coral reefs are among the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth, rivaled only by tropical rainforests. This biodiversity arises from several factors working together. First, structural complexity. The three-dimensional architecture of the reef creates countless niches: caves, crevices, overhangs, channels, surfaces, each providing different habitat conditions. Fish that need shelter from predators hide in coral branches. Predators patrol the reef edges. Nocturnal creatures shelter during the day and emerge at night. The complexity allows many species to coexist by partitioning space and resources. Second, productivity. The coral-algae symbiosis generates massive amounts of organic matter from sunlight, supporting food webs. The algae photosynthesize, corals capture plankton, and this productivity supports herbivores, which support carnivores, creating multiple trophic levels. Third, nutrient cycling. In nutrient-poor tropical waters, reefs recycle nutrients efficiently. Coral mucus provides food for bacteria and small animals. Fish excrete nutrients that algae absorb. Sponges filter and process water. Nothing is wasted. Fourth, diversity begets diversity. The presence of many species creates more opportunities for specialization. Cleaner fish evolve to remove parasites from larger fish. Specialized crabs live only on specific coral species. Symbioses develop between unlikely partners. Fifth, stability. Reefs provide stable habitat over decades to centuries, allowing specialized species to evolve. The combination of these factors creates what ecologists call a biodiversity hotspot, where life flourishes in extraordinary variety. An area of reef the size of a car might harbor thousands of individuals from hundreds of species, each playing a role in the ecosystem's function. The reef is not just a collection of species, but an interwoven community where everything connects, and the loss of any part threatens the stability of the whole. Why are coral reefs called the rainforests of the sea? Here's a comparison that captures the essence. Both coral reefs and rainforests are biodiversity hotspots, ecosystems supporting disproportionate numbers of species relative to their area. Both occupy relatively small fractions of Earth's surface, but contain huge percentages of total species. Both have high structural complexity that creates numerous ecological niches. Both rely on symbiotic relationships, corals and algae, trees and mycorrhizal fungi, that allow them to thrive in seemingly nutrient-poor environments. Both are found primarily in tropical regions. Both are ancient ecosystems that have developed over millions of years. Both are under severe threat from human activities. But the comparison goes deeper. In rainforests, nutrients are locked in biomass and cycled efficiently. Remove the forest and the soil is poor. Similarly, reefs exist in nutrient-poor waters, but create oases of productivity through efficient recycling. Both ecosystems have high productivity, generating large amounts of organic matter from sunlight that supports complex food webs. Both provide crucial ecosystem services. Rainforests generate oxygen and regulate climate. Reefs protect coastlines and support fisheries. Both are being destroyed faster than they can regenerate. Rainforests by logging and burning, reefs by warming, pollution, and overfishing. The parallel is sobering. We've watched tropical forests shrink alarmingly, and we're now watching reefs disappear. The nickname rainforests of the sea isn't just poetic, it's a warning. If we wouldn't want to lose the Amazon, why would we accept losing the Great Barrier Reef? Both are irreplaceable treasures, complex systems that took millions of years to develop and that we're destroying in decades. The comparison helps people who've never seen a reef understand what's at stake. An underwater world as vital, diverse, and worthy of protection as any forest on land. How many species live in coral reefs? Think about counting the inhabitants of this underwater metropolis. Scientists estimate that coral reefs support somewhere between 1 and 9 million species, though the vast majority haven't been formally described or even discovered yet. What we know is already staggering. Over 4,000 species of fish, 800 species of reef-building corals, countless invertebrates including crustaceans, mollusks, echinoderms, and worms, plus sponges, algae, and microorganisms, in numbers we're only beginning to comprehend. A single coral colony might host hundreds of species of tiny creatures, copepods, amphipods, worms, living among its branches. A square meter of reef can contain thousands of individual organisms from dozens or hundreds of species. The biodiversity is layered and interconnected. Many species are specialists, found only in reef environments. sometimes only with specific coral species or in specific reef zones. This specialization makes reefs incredibly rich, but also fragile. Lose the coral, and the specialists disappear. New species are discovered regularly. Recent expeditions, using advanced diving technology and genetic analysis, reveal that we've vastly underestimated reef biodiversity. Every time scientists survey a poorly studied reef region, they find species new to science. The actual total might be much higher than current estimates. Microbes alone, bacteria, archaea, viruses, number in the trillions per square meter, performing crucial functions we're only beginning to understand. The reef is not just diverse invisible animals, but in the invisible machinery that keeps the ecosystem functioning. Each species, from the largest shark to the smallest bacterium, plays roles in nutrient cycling, energy flow, and ecosystem stability. The sheer number of species makes reefs incredibly complex, resilient in some ways, but vulnerable in others, especially when multiple stressors act simultaneously. What predators hunt coral polyps? Let's consider the creatures that feed on coral itself. While many animals live on or near coral, relatively few actually eat the coral polyps. The coral's tissue is relatively low in nutritional value and often protected by the stinging nematocysts. However, specialized predators have evolved to overcome these defenses. Crown of thorns starfish are perhaps the most infamous coral predators. These large, spiny starfish evert their stomachs over coral, secreting digestive enzymes that dissolve the tissue, which they then absorb. A single crown of thorns can consume several square meters of coral per year. Outbreaks of these starfish, possibly triggered by nutrient pollution promoting larval survival, can devastate large reef areas. Parrotfish scrape algae from dead coral skeletons and sometimes consume live coral tissue in the process, but they're primarily herbivores. Butterfly fish include some species that feed almost exclusively on coral polyps, using elongated snouts to reach polyps in branching corals. Certain snails, including Drupella species, feed on coral tissue. Some bristleworms and fireworms are opportunistic coral feeders, attacking damaged or stressed corals. Among fish, filefish and some triggerfish consume coral. These coral lovers play complex roles at low densities. They might help control algae or clean up damaged coral, but at high densities, or when corals are already stressed, they can push reefs toward degradation. Climate change is altering predator-prey dynamics. As corals weaken from bleaching or disease, they become more vulnerable to predators they might otherwise resist. Controlling outbreaks of corallivores, particularly crown of thorns starfish, has become part of reef management in some regions. Though it's addressing symptoms rather than root causes, the balance between coral growth and predation is another delicate equilibrium that human impacts are disrupting. How do fish and corals help each other? Here's another layer of reef symbiosis. While the coral-algae relationship is most fundamental, fish and corals also share mutually beneficial relationships. Fish provide services to corals while benefiting from the habitat corals create. Herbivorous fish, like parrotfish and surgeonfish, graze on algae growing on the reef. This prevents algae from overgrowing and smothering corals, particularly important after disturbances when fast-growing algae might otherwise outcompete recovering corals. On reefs where herbivorous fish have been overfished, algae can dominate, preventing coral recovery. Some fish, like dam shellfish, defend territories on coral, aggressively chasing away coral predators, like crown of thorns starfish or coral-liverous fish, effectively protecting the coral. The fish benefits by having exclusive access to the algae growing in its territory, while the coral benefits from protection. Fish excrete nitrogen and phosphorus in their waste, which corals and their algae can absorb as nutrients. In nutrient-poor waters, this fertilization helps coral growth. The physical presence of fish schools can enhance water flow around corals, bringing more food particles and oxygen while removing waste. Some fish species eat parasites or diseased tissue from corals, acting as cleaners that improve coral health. Corals, in turn, provide fish with habitat, shelter from predators, places to sleep at night, surfaces to lay eggs on, and territories to defend. The three-dimensional structure of the reef creates the habitat complexity that allows diverse fish communities to coexist. Remove the coral, and fish diversity collapses. Remove the fish, and coral health declines. They're partners in maintaining the ecosystem, each dependent on the other. Another example of how reef health depends on intact ecological relationships rather than just individual species survival. What animals depend entirely on coral reefs? Think about the specialists, species so adapted to reef life that they cannot survive anywhere else. These obligate reef species are at greatest risk when reefs decline. Certain butterfly fish feed exclusively on coral polyps and cannot switch to other foods, lose the coral, and these fish starve. Some gobies live only among the branches of specific coral species, never venturing more than centimeters from their host. Certain barnacles settle only on particular coral species. Various crabs, shrimps, and snails are found exclusively on or within coral colonies, having evolved such specific relationships that they're essentially extensions of the coral itself. Many seahorses and pipefish depend on complex reef structure for camouflage and hunting. Mandarin fish, with their spectacular coloring, live exclusively in reef environments and feed on tiny invertebrates hiding among coral. Some dam shellfish not only live on reefs, but require specific coral species to lay their eggs. Juvenile stages of many fish species depend absolutely on reef habitat for survival, even if adults range more widely. Remove the reef nursery, and populations collapse. Sea turtles feed on reef sponges and algae, and nest on beaches near reefs. Humphead wrasse, massive fish that can live for decades, require healthy reefs throughout their lives. These obligate species are essentially hostages to reef health. As reefs degrade, these specialists are among the first to disappear, and their loss further destabilizes the ecosystem. Their complete dependence on reefs makes them powerful indicators of reef health. If obligate species are thriving, the reef is healthy. If they're declining, the reef is in trouble. Protecting obligate reef species means protecting entire reef ecosystems, since you cannot save one without saving the other. They're evolutionary products of millions of years of adaptation to reef life, and they represent investments we cannot recreate if they're lost. How do sea anemones and clownfish work together? Let's explore one of the ocean's most charming partnerships: clownfish. Those orange and white fish, made famous by movies, live among the tentacles of sea anemones, forming one of the most recognizable symbiotic relationships in the ocean. Anemones are related to corals, also cnidarians, with stinging tentacles used to capture prey. Most fish avoid anemones because the stinging cells can paralyze or kill them, but clownfish are immune, protected by a mucus coating that prevents the anemone from recognizing them as prey. The clownfish gains shelter. The anemone's tentacles provide a safe haven from predators, a place to sleep, and a territory to defend. Female clownfish lay eggs at the anemone's base, where the male guards them until they hatch. The anemone gains several benefits. Clownfish are aggressive, chasing away butterfly fish and other species that might prey on the anemone. The clownfish's constant movement among the tentacles increases water circulation, improving oxygen flow and removing debris. The fish's waste provides nutrients that the anemone and any zooxanthellae it might host can absorb. Some researchers suggest clownfish might even lure prey toward the anemone, though this remains debated. The relationship is so tight that some clownfish species are found only with specific anemone species. Clownfish have complex social structures within anemone groups. All clownfish are born male, and the largest individual in a group changes sex to become the breeding female. If she dies, the next largest male transforms. This ensures the anemone always has a breeding pair, without individuals needing to travel dangerously across open water to find mates. The partnership illustrates how evolution fine-tunes relationships, creating dependencies that benefit both partners. It's also a reminder that reef ecosystems are webs of such relationships, each one essential to the participants and collectively creating the reef's resilience and complexity. What is the most dangerous creature in a reef? Here's a question that reveals our biases. When people think dangerous, they often think sharks, but the most dangerous reef creatures to humans are often the smallest. Box jellyfish, with tentacles trailing meters behind their bell, deliver venom so potent it can kill a human within minutes through cardiac arrest. Their transparent bodies make them nearly invisible until you're stung. Cone snails, beautiful shells often collected by beachcombers, have harpoon-like teeth, delivering venom that can paralyze or kill. There's no anti-venom for many species. Stonefish, masters of camouflage that look exactly like rocks, have venomous spines along their back that deliver excruciating pain and can be lethal if untreated. Blue-ringed octopuses, small enough to sit in your palm, carry venom containing tetrodotoxin, the same poison as pufferfish, capable of causing paralysis and death. Fire coral, despite its name actually a hydroid related to jellyfish, delivers painful stings that can cause severe allergic reactions. Sea snakes, swimming through reef waters, are highly venomous, though rarely aggressive. Stingrays hiding in sand can deliver defensive strikes with barbed, venomous tail spines. Yet none of these animals are aggressive toward humans. Almost all dangerous encounters result from accidental contact or defensive reactions. The reef's truly dangerous inhabitants, from a human perspective, are dangers primarily because we intrude into their environment without recognizing the hazards. The most dangerous creature in the reef might actually be humans, capable of destroying entire ecosystems through overfishing, pollution, and climate change, threats that fish, corals, and all reef inhabitants cannot defend against. The reef's venomous creatures evolved their defenses over millions of years for survival, not aggression. We've become dangerous to reefs in mere decades, through carelessness and greed. How do sharks protect coral reefs? Think about apex predators and their cascading effects. Sharks play crucial roles in reef ecosystems, primarily through what ecologists call top-down control. Predators, regulating populations of prey species, which in turn affects the entire food web. Reef sharks, including black tip, white tip, gray reef, and nurse sharks, hunt mid-level predators, like groupers and snappers, and herbivorous fish. Their presence alters prey behavior. Fish avoid areas where sharks hunt, distributing grazing and predation pressure across the reef, rather than concentrating it. This prevents overgrazing of any single area and reduces predation pressure on smaller fish and invertebrates. Sharks also perform what's called consumptive and non-consumptive effects. They kill some prey consumptive, but also make prey more cautious, changing feeding patterns and habitat use. Non-consumptive. Both effects shape reef communities. Sharks preferentially hunt weak, sick, or injured fish, removing individuals that might otherwise spread disease through populations. This natural selection helps maintain healthy prey populations. Studies comparing reefs with healthy shark populations to reefs where sharks have been fished out show dramatic differences. Reefs without sharks often have too many mid-level predators, which overconsume herbivorous fish, leading to algal overgrowth that smothers corals. The loss of sharks initiates a trophic cascade that can flip the ecosystem from coral-dominated to algae-dominated. Shark presence also provides a landscape of fear that benefits corals. When herbivores are cautious, they spend less time in any one spot, reducing localized overgrazing while still controlling overall algae levels. Protecting sharks isn't just about conserving charismatic megafauna. It's about maintaining the ecological processes that keep reefs healthy. Overfishing sharks removes a critical control mechanism, and reef ecosystems suffer as a result. Why do some fish change color or shape in coral reefs? Let's explore the visual wizardry of reef fish. Many species display remarkable abilities to change appearance, serving multiple functions. Some fish change color for camouflage, matching their background to avoid predators or to ambush prey. Flounders and cuttlefish are masters of this, changing patterns and colors within seconds to match sand, rock, or coral. Others change color to communicate. Many species display different colors when courting, threatening rivals, or submitting to dominant fish. Parrotfish can shift from drab females to brilliantly colored males when they change sex. Some fish have different day and night coloration, bright and visible during the day, then shifting to drab or dark patterns at night for camouflage while sleeping. Juvenile fish often look completely different from adults, possibly to avoid aggression from adult territories holders or to mimic unpalatable species. Cleaner fish have specific coloration advertising their cleaning services, while some predatory fish have evolved to mimic cleaner fish, allowing them to approach unsuspecting prey. Shape changes are often about perceived size. Many fish can flare fins or puff up their bodies to appear larger when threatened. Pufferfish famously inflate by gulping water, transforming from normal fish into spiky balls too large for predators to swallow. The combination of color and pattern changes serves survival, reproduction, and social communication. This visual diversity is possible because reef fish have excellent color vision. Unlike many terrestrial animals, most fish can see color well, making visual communication effective. The clear, sunlit water of reefs enhances visibility, allowing these visual signals to work. The reef is essentially a visual display, where every color and pattern means something, where appearance conveys information about species, sex, age, mood, and intent. This visual complexity is another dimension of reef biodiversity, a communication system as sophisticated as any bird song or primate gesture. How do coral reefs protect coastlines from storms? Here's where the reef's value becomes tangibly economic. Coral reefs act as natural breakwaters, absorbing wave energy before it reaches shore. When ocean swells approach a reef, the waves break over the shallow reef structure, dissipating their energy. Studies show reefs can reduce wave energy by up to 97%, dramatically decreasing the height and power of waves reaching the beach. This protection is most critical during storms and hurricanes, when wave energy is highest. Reefs buffer storm surge, preventing the most catastrophic flooding that occurs when hurricanes push massive volumes of water toward shore. The three-dimensional structure of the reef creates friction and turbulence that slows water movement. Reefs also trap sediment, helping beaches maintain their sand and preventing erosion. Without reefs, coastlines erode faster, beaches narrow, and properties become vulnerable to storm damage. The economic value of this protection is enormous. A healthy reef, protecting a populated coastline, provides wave reduction worth millions or even billions of dollars, compared to building artificial structures like seawalls or constantly replenishing eroded beaches. When reefs degrade from bleaching, storms, or human damage, their protective function diminishes. Dead or flattened reefs provide less friction and structure to break waves. Studies comparing coasts protected by healthy reefs to those with degraded reefs or no reefs show significantly higher erosion rates and storm damage without reef protection. This is why reef conservation isn't just an environmental issue, it's coastal infrastructure. Many island nations and coastal communities depend entirely on reef protection. Lose the reef, and communities become uninhabitable. As climate change increases, storm intensity and sea level rise threatens coasts. Healthy reefs become even more critical for coastal resilience. Protecting reefs is protecting human communities, livelihoods, and homes as much as protecting biodiversity. What role do reefs play in preventing floods and erosion? Think about the daily protection reefs provide. Not just during extreme events, even normal ocean swells and tides would cause significant erosion Without reefs buffering the coast, reefs maintain beach profiles by trapping sediment that would otherwise wash out to sea. The reduced wave energy behind reefs creates calm lagoons where sediment settles rather than being suspended and carried away. Mangroves and seagrass beds often grow in these protected lagoons, providing additional stabilization. Roots hold sediment and further dampen wave action. The combination of reef, lagoon, seagrass, and mangrove creates a coastal protection system far more effective and cheaper than any human engineering. Reefs also help prevent flooding by reducing the volume and speed of water moving toward shore during high tides and storm surges. The reef crest, the shallowest part where waves break, creates a barrier that water must flow over or through, limiting the rate at which water can accumulate on shore. This buffering gives water time to recede, preventing the rapid inundation that causes most flood damage. In low-lying island nations like the Maldives or Marshall Islands, where the highest natural elevation is just a few meters above sea level, reefs are the only protection against flooding. Without reefs, many of these islands would be regularly overwashed by ordinary high tides, much less storms. Reef degradation increases flooding frequency and severity, forcing communities to invest in expensive engineered solutions, seawalls, elevated buildings, improved drainage that ultimately cost far more than reef conservation would have. The connection between reef health and coastal safety is direct and measurable. Every meter of reef that dies increases the risk to human communities behind it, and in many cases, artificial solutions simply cannot replace what natural reefs provide in terms of wave reduction and coastal stabilization. How much of the world's coastlines depend on coral? Let's consider the global scale of reef-dependent communities. Approximately 200 million people live within 50 kilometers of coral reefs and derive some economic benefit from them. About 850 million people live within 100 kilometers of reefs. These communities depend on reefs for fisheries, tourism, coastal protection, and cultural identity. Small island developing states, nations like Palau, Maldives, Seychelles, many Caribbean islands, derive more than half their GDP from reef-related activities, primarily tourism and fishing. For these nations, reef loss would be economic catastrophe. Over 100 countries have coral reefs within their territorial waters. The countries with the largest reef areas include Indonesia, Australia, the Philippines, France through overseas territories, Papua New Guinea, and Mexico. Reefs protect roughly 150,000 kilometers of coastline from waves and storms. The replacement value of this protection, what it would cost to build and maintain seawalls providing equivalent protection, is estimated at hundreds of billions of dollars globally. Coastal property values are significantly higher behind healthy reefs compared to areas without reef protection. Insurance costs are lower where reefs provide storm protection. In terms of food security, coral reef fisheries directly support about 6 million fishers globally and indirectly feed many millions more. Reefs support about 1/4 of all ocean fish species, and many commercially important species depend on reefs during some life stage. The protein from reef fisheries is critical for food security in developing tropical nations, where alternative protein sources are expensive or unavailable. Beyond direct economic value, reefs have enormous cultural and spiritual significance for many coastal and island peoples, featured in traditional practices, navigation, art, and identity. The relationship between human communities and reefs goes back thousands of years. Many indigenous Pacific Island cultures have detailed traditional knowledge about reef ecology, fishing practices, and conservation, knowledge now being integrated with modern science to improve reef management. The web of human dependence on reefs is complex and often invisible to people living far from coasts, but for hundreds of millions, reef health is directly tied to livelihood, safety, and cultural continuity. Can coral reefs affect global weather? Here's a question about broader connections. Coral reefs themselves don't directly control global weather systems. They're too small a portion of ocean area But reef ecosystems are part of larger ocean processes that do influence climate and weather. Reefs affect local climate by modifying water properties. The high productivity of reefs affects water chemistry, oxygen levels, pH, carbon dioxide concentrations in surrounding waters. Reefs create their own microclimates underwater, affecting water temperature, current patterns, and nutrient distribution in nearby ocean areas. Some scientists have proposed that the massive calcium carbonate structures of reefs might affect regional ocean circulation patterns, though this is speculative and difficult to measure. More significantly, reefs are indicators of ocean health, and ocean health profoundly affects global weather. Healthy oceans regulate climate by absorbing heat and carbon dioxide. As reefs die from warming and acidification, it signals that ocean chemistry and temperature are shifting in ways that will affect weather patterns globally. The loss of reefs correlates with ocean changes that intensify storms, alter rainfall patterns, and disrupt monsoons that billions of people depend on. Reefs also influence weather indirectly through their protection of mangroves and coastal wetlands. These ecosystems store enormous amounts of carbon and influence regional humidity and rainfall. When reefs degrade, the ecosystems behind them often collapse too, releasing stored carbon and altering local weather patterns. Additionally, the Great Barrier Reef and other large reef systems might influence regional cloud formation and rainfall through their effects on ocean surface temperature and evaporation rates, though research on this is ongoing. While individual reefs don't control global weather, the worldwide decline of reefs is part of larger ocean ecosystem changes that do affect climate and weather systems, making reef conservation part of climate stabilization efforts. Reefs are threads in the fabric of global environmental systems, and pulling on one thread affects the whole tapestry. How do reefs store carbon and support the planet's climate? Think about the reef's role in the carbon cycle. Reefs interact with carbon in complex ways. On one hand, coral growth removes carbon dioxide from seawater to build calcium carbonate skeletons. This process, called calcification, actually releases CO2 back into the water through a chemical reaction. For every unit of calcium carbonate formed, about half a unit of CO2 is released. So calcification is not net carbon sequestration. However, the organic matter produced by the coral algae symbiosis, by photosynthesis from reef algae and seagrasses, and by all the primary production in reef ecosystems, does represent carbon storage. Some of this organic carbon is buried in reef sediments, effectively removing it from the active carbon cycle for thousands of years or more. Reef-associated ecosystems, particularly mangroves and seagrass beds, are among the most efficient carbon storage systems on Earth. They bury carbon in sediments at rates far exceeding most terrestrial ecosystems. When you account for the entire reef ecosystem complex, the net effect is probably modest carbon sequestration. More important is the reef's role as a carbon cycling hub. Reefs take carbon from dissolved forms in the water and transform it into biomass and carbonate rock. They're part of the ocean's broader carbon pump that helps regulate atmospheric CO2. As reefs die, this regulation is disrupted. Dead reefs stop calcifying and may actually dissolve as ocean acidification makes seawater corrosive to calcium carbonate, releasing stored carbon. Degraded reef ecosystems lose the biological productivity that created organic carbon storage. The mangroves and seagrasses that often depend on reefs for coastal protection are lost, releasing their enormous carbon stores. The collapse of reef ecosystems thus contributes to increasing atmospheric CO2, creating a positive feedback loop. Climate change destroys reefs, which reduces ocean carbon storage, which accelerates climate change. Protecting reefs is part of climate change mitigation, not just biodiversity conservation. Healthy reefs help stabilize carbon cycles. Dead reefs contribute to the problem. What is coral bleaching? Let's look closely at this haunting phenomenon. Coral bleaching is when corals lose their symbiotic zooxanthellae algae and turn ghostly white. The coral itself isn't dead yet, but without its algae, it's losing 90% of its food source and is starving. Bleaching happens when corals are stressed, most commonly by water temperature rising just 2 or 3 degrees Celsius above normal summer maximums for several weeks. The stress disrupts the symbiosis. The algae's photosynthesis machinery begins malfunctioning, producing harmful reactive oxygen species that damage coral tissue. The coral, sensing damage, expels the algae as a defense mechanism. Other stressors can also cause bleaching, excessive sunlight, pollution, low salinity from heavy rainfall or runoff, sedimentation, and disease. The visual transformation is dramatic. Healthy corals are golden, brown, or greenish from their algae, often with additional colors from fluorescent proteins. Bleached corals are stark white, the pale calcium carbonate skeleton showing through translucent tissue. Walking over a bleached reef is eerie. Everything is pale, lifeless looking, though technically still alive. The coral can recover if stress is removed quickly. Within weeks to months, it can reacquire algae from the water or from remnant populations in its tissue. But recovery is uncertain and leaves corals weakened, more susceptible to disease, and slower to grow and reproduce. If stress continues for too long, if water stays hot for months, the coral dies, tissue degrades, skeleton becomes exposed, and algae and bacteria colonize the dead surface. What was living coral becomes rubble. Mass bleaching events, affecting vast reef areas simultaneously, are becoming more frequent and severe as ocean temperatures rise from climate change. Events that once happened every few decades now occur every few years, not giving reefs time to recover between bleaching episodes. The repetition is pushing reefs toward collapse. Why do corals turn white? Here's the visual explanation. Corals appear white when bleached because you're seeing the calcium carbonate skeleton through the translucent tissue. Normally, the zooxanthellae algae living in coral tissue provide color, browns, golds, greens, masking the white skeleton. When corals expel their algae, the pigment disappears. The coral tissue itself is mostly transparent or slightly translucent, so without the colorful algae, you see right through to the white limestone beneath. It's like looking through a thin film of plastic wrap at white paper. The paper's whiteness dominates what you see. Some bleached corals show faint colors from fluorescent proteins the coral produces, which is why bleached corals sometimes appear slightly pink, blue, or purple, rather than pure white. These fluorescent proteins don't photosynthesize and don't provide energy, but they might represent the coral's attempt to protect any remaining algae or to signal for new algae to return. The whiteness is shocking because it's so unnatural. Reefs are supposed to be colorful. Seeing acres of bleached coral is like seeing a forest where all the leaves have fallen off in midsummer, a visual indicator that something is profoundly wrong. Photographers documenting bleaching events capture haunting images of white coral fields stretching to the horizon. What should be vibrant ecosystems turned into ghostly underwater graveyards. The color, or lack thereof, becomes a powerful communication tool, making the invisible crisis of ocean warming visible to people who may never visit a reef. The stark white of bleached coral is nature's distress signal, a cry for help from an ecosystem in crisis, a visual representation of what happens when the partnership between coral and algae fails under stress we're imposing on the ocean. What causes coral bleaching events? Think about the triggers and the patterns. Coral bleaching occurs when environmental conditions exceed coral's tolerance, with elevated temperature being the primary cause. Sea surface temperatures even 2 degrees Celsius above typical summer maximum for 4 to 8 weeks can trigger mass bleaching. The temperature threshold varies by location. Corals in naturally warmer areas can tolerate slightly higher temperatures than those in cooler regions, but all have limits. Climate change is increasing baseline ocean temperatures and causing more frequent and intense marine heat waves, periods when ocean temperature spikes well above normal. These heat waves, lasting weeks to months, are the main drivers of recent mass bleaching events. The warming is caused by greenhouse gas accumulation in the atmosphere. trapping heat, basic physics that's been understood for over a century and is now playing out in real time. Other stressors can contribute to or trigger bleaching. Excessive solar radiation, particularly UV, can bleach corals in very shallow water. Low salinity, from heavy rainfall or flood, runoff stresses corals adapted to stable ocean salinity. Pollution, including agricultural runoff containing pesticides and fertilizers, can weaken corals and make them more susceptible to bleaching at lower temperatures. Sedimentation from coastal development or dredging smothers corals and blocks light needed for photosynthesis, causing stress. Local conditions matter. Corals already stressed by pollution bleach at lower temperatures than pristine corals. This is why addressing all threats, not just climate change, is important for reef resilience. Climate models predict that without dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, mass bleaching will become annual events for most reefs by mid-century, meaning no recovery time between episodes. Some reefs will experience bleaching multiple times per decade, pushing them beyond recovery capacity. The frequency of bleaching is accelerating. The interval between mass bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef has shrunk from decades to years. Can corals recover from bleaching? Let's explore the possibilities and limitations of recovery. Yes, corals can recover from bleaching, but recovery depends on several factors. If the stress is short-lived, water temperatures return to normal within a few weeks. Many corals can reacquire zooxanthellae and survive. The coral can take up algae from the surrounding water, or rebuild populations from algae that survived in small numbers within the tissue. Recovery takes months. During this time, the coral is vulnerable. It's growing slowly, not reproducing, and susceptible to disease. Even after regaining algae, the coral may remain weakened for years. If bleaching is severe or prolonged, mortality rates increase. Corals that lose more than 90% of their algae have much lower survival rates. Corals weakened by bleaching are also more likely to succumb to disease, predation, or competition from algae. Recovery also depends on coral species. Some species are more resilient, recovering from bleaching more reliably than others. Faster-growing branching corals, while more susceptible to bleaching, can recover more quickly if they survive. Massive corals are often more resistant to bleaching, but recover more slowly when they do bleach. Regional conditions matter too. Reefs with good water quality, healthy fish populations, and low local stress recover better than reefs already degraded by pollution or overfishing. The key limitation is time. Recovery requires years to decades, time for corals to regrow, reproduce, and rebuild populations. But bleaching events are now occurring more frequently, not giving reefs enough recovery time. A reef hit by bleaching may only partially recover before the next event strikes, progressively degrading with each cycle. This ratcheting effect, where reefs don't fully recover between disturbances, pushes ecosystems toward collapse. Some areas of the Great Barrier Reef have experienced severe bleaching in consecutive years, leaving no opportunity for recovery. The question isn't whether corals can recover, it's whether we'll give them time to by stabilizing ocean temperatures. How does climate change threaten coral reefs? Here's the compounding crisis. Climate change threatens reefs through multiple mechanisms, acting simultaneously. Rising ocean temperatures cause bleaching, already discussed, but warming also stresses corals, even below bleaching thresholds, slowing growth and reproduction. Warmer water holds less oxygen, creating additional stress. Higher temperatures increase coral metabolism, requiring more energy when food supply doesn't increase. Climate change also intensifies storms. Stronger hurricanes physically destroy reef structure, breaking apart corals that took decades to grow. While reefs naturally recover from occasional storms, more frequent intense storms prevent recovery. Sea level rise, caused by thermal expansion of warming water and melting ice sheets, changes the light environment for shallow corals and can increase wave energy reaching reefs. Ocean acidification, discussed more below, makes it harder for corals to build skeletons and can dissolve existing structures. Changes in ocean circulation patterns affect larval dispersal, potentially isolating reef populations and preventing genetic exchange needed for adaptation. Altered rainfall patterns change salinity and sediment delivery to coastal reefs. Range shifts of coral predators and diseases, expanding into previously unsuitable areas as waters warm, increase predation, and infection pressure on corals. The sum of these impacts is greater than any single threat. They interact and amplify each other. A coral stressed by warming is more susceptible to disease. A reef recovering from bleaching is more vulnerable to storm damage. Ocean acidification slows recovery from physical damage. This multi-stressor environment makes it nearly impossible for reefs to adapt fast enough. Climate change isn't a future threat to reefs. It's happening now, measurably, and is the primary driver of current reef decline worldwide. Addressing climate change is essential for reef survival. Local conservation efforts, while important, cannot save reefs if ocean conditions continue deteriorating. How does ocean acidification harm coral skeletons? Think about chemistry at the molecular level. The ocean absorbs about a quarter of the CO2 we emit into the atmosphere. When CO2 dissolves in seawater, it forms carbonic acid, which lowers the pH, making the ocean more acidic. Since the Industrial Revolution, ocean pH has dropped by about 0.1 units, which sounds small, but represents a 30% increase in acidity on the logarithmic pH scale. This acidification affects the carbonate chemistry of seawater. Coral skeletons are made of calcium carbonate in the form of aragonite. Corals build these skeletons by extracting calcium and carbonate ions from seawater. As seawater becomes more acidic, the concentration of carbonate ions decreases. This makes it harder for corals to calcify. They must expend more energy to extract the ions they need from more dilute solutions. Studies show that calcification rates decline measurably with even modest pH drops. If acidification continues, the ocean will eventually reach a point where it becomes undersaturated with respect to aragonite, meaning aragonite naturally dissolves rather than precipitates. At that point, coral skeletons will dissolve unless corals can actively defend them, which requires even more energy. Some ocean regions are already experiencing seasonal undersaturation. The effect compounds with warming. Warmer water holds less dissolved carbonate, making acidification worse. Experiments exposing corals to predicted future pH levels show dramatic declines in growth rates. Some corals cease growing entirely. Young corals and larvae are especially vulnerable. They may be unable to build initial skeletons in acidified water, preventing recruitment of new corals even if adults survive. Reef structures also weaken. The balance between calcification and erosion shifts toward erosion. Dead coral skeletons, which normally persist for years and provide structure, dissolve faster in acidified water. Ocean acidification is sometimes called osteoporosis of the sea. It makes skeletons weak and brittle, undermining the physical foundation of the reef, even before killing the coral animals themselves. What happens when the ocean gets too hot? Let's trace the cascade of warming effects. When ocean temperatures exceed coral tolerance thresholds, the immediate response is bleaching, as we've discussed. But prolonged warming causes deeper problems. Coral reproduction is disrupted. Heat stress can prevent corals from developing gametes, reduce spawning success, or cause early release of immature eggs and sperm that won't fertilize. This reproductive failure means even if adult corals survive, no new recruits replenish the population. Warming also accelerates coral disease. Higher temperatures boost the growth rates of pathogenic bacteria, fungi, and viruses, while weakening coral immune systems. Diseases spread faster, killing corals that survived initial bleaching. White syndrome, black band disease, and other coral diseases become more prevalent and deadly in warmer waters. The balance between coral growth and bioerosion shifts. Boring organisms, sponges, worms, mollusks that tunnel into coral skeletons work faster in warmer water, weakening structures. Algae grow faster, potentially outcompeting corals for space. Fish metabolism increases, requiring more food, which can increase pressure on coral polyps from coral lovers. Warm water's lower oxygen content stresses all marine life. Prolonged warming can cause ecosystem phase shifts. The reef flips from coral-dominated to algae-dominated states. Once algae take over, they can prevent coral recovery even if temperatures return to normal, because algae shade the substrate and inhibit coral larvae from settling. These algae-dominated reefs have lower biodiversity, reduced structural complexity, and provide fewer ecosystem services. The transition can happen surprisingly quickly. Some reefs have flipped in just a few years. Reversing these shifts is extraordinarily difficult. The ecosystem has settled into a new stable state. Climate models project that if global temperatures rise 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, virtually all coral reefs worldwide will experience annual severe bleaching and will likely transition to algae-dominated states. At 2 degrees warming, most reefs face similar fates. The window for preventing catastrophic reef loss is closing rapidly. Are pollution and overfishing bigger threats than we think? Here's an uncomfortable truth. While climate change dominates headlines about reef threats, local stressors like pollution and overfishing may actually determine which reefs survive the climate crisis and which don't. Pollution comes in many forms. Nutrient runoff from agriculture causes algae blooms that smother corals and deplete oxygen. Sediment from deforestation, construction, and dredging physically smothers corals and blocks light. Pesticides and herbicides are directly toxic to corals and their algae. Heavy metals from mining and industry accumulate in reef organisms. Microplastics are consumed by corals and reef animals, with unknown long-term effects. Oil spills coat corals, blocking light and releasing toxic compounds. Even sewage, containing pathogens and nutrients, degrades reefs. The effects compound. Polluted reefs are less resilient to bleaching, recovering more slowly, and suffering higher mortality. Overfishing is equally damaging. Removing herbivorous fish like parrotfish allows algae to overgrow corals. Taking predators disrupts food webs, causing cascades that alter entire communities. Destructive fishing practices, blast fishing, cyanide fishing, bottom trawling, directly destroy reef structure. Ghost gear, abandoned fishing nets and lines, continues catching and killing reef organisms for years. Fishing during spawning aggregations can decimate populations unable to recover. The interaction between local and global stressors is critical. A reef protected from local threats, with clean water, abundant herbivores, intact predator populations, has much better chances of surviving bleaching and recovering afterward. Reefs already degraded by pollution and overfishing have little resilience. Climate change pushes them over the edge. This means local conservation actions matter enormously. We can't stop climate change overnight, but we can reduce pollution and implement sustainable fishing immediately. Protecting reefs from local stressors buys them time and resilience, giving them the best possible chance to survive while we address the larger climate problem. Ignoring local threats because climate change is bigger would be a fatal mistake. What are ghost nets, and why are they so deadly? Think about fishing gear that never stops fishing. Ghost nets are fishing nets, lines, and traps that have been lost or deliberately abandoned in the ocean. Made of durable synthetic materials, nylon, plastic, they can persist for decades or centuries without decomposing. These ghost nets drift with currents or snag on reefs, continuing to catch and kill marine life indiscriminately. Fish, turtles, dolphins, seals, and even whales become entangled, unable to escape, drowning or starving. The dead animals attract scavengers, which also become entangled, creating a continuous cycle of death. On reefs, ghost nets are particularly destructive. They drape over coral formations, smothering polyps, blocking light, and abrading tissue as they shift with waves and currents. Nets snag on coral and tear loose during storms, ripping apart coral structures that took decades to grow. The nets create dead zones, where nothing can survive beneath their suffocating weight. Cleanup is dangerous and difficult. Divers must carefully cut nets away without damaging coral, sometimes requiring many hours to remove a single net. Nets tangled in complex reef structure may be impossible to remove completely without causing more damage. The scale is staggering. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of ghost nets are drifting in oceans or snagged on reefs worldwide. Every year, hundreds of thousands of tons of fishing gear are lost or abandoned. In some areas, ghost nets account for significant portions of reef damage. The problem is solvable. Better fishing practices, gear tracking, retrieval programs, and penalties for abandonment could dramatically reduce ghost net pollution. Some organizations now specialize in ghost net removal, using volunteer divers to clear reefs. But prevention is more effective than cleanup. Reducing the amount of gear entering the ocean in the first place would save countless lives and protect reefs from this entirely avoidable threat. How does plastic waste affect coral reefs? Let's explore this pervasive modern threat. Plastic pollution affects reefs in multiple ways, from microscopic to massive scales. Microplastics, tiny fragments less than 5 millimeters, are ubiquitous in ocean water. Corals mistake them for food and consume them, clogging their digestive systems and potentially introducing toxins. Microplastics can block light when concentrated near the surface, reducing photosynthesis by zooxanthellae. They serve as vectors for pathogens and harmful bacteria, potentially introducing diseases to corals. Larger plastic debris, bags, bottles, packaging, drifts onto reefs and smothers corals, blocking light and abrading tissue as it moves with currents. Plastic sheeting and bags create anoxic zones beneath them where nothing can survive. Plastic debris also provides surfaces for algae growth, which can then spread onto nearby corals. Some plastics leach toxic chemicals, additives, like plasticizers, flame retardants, and UV stabilizers that are harmful to corals and reef organisms. Microplastics can absorb and concentrate pollutants from seawater, delivering toxic compounds when consumed. Studies comparing reefs with high and low plastic pollution show that plastic-polluted reefs have higher disease prevalence. Coral diseases increase 20-fold where plastic is present. The plastic appears to introduce pathogens or weaken coral immunity. The sheer volume is overwhelming. Millions of tons of plastic enter the ocean annually, and a significant fraction ends up on reefs. Some remote reefs, far from human populations, are nonetheless heavily polluted by plastic that drifted on currents from distant sources. Beach and reef cleanups remove some plastic, but new material arrives constantly. The solution requires reducing plastic production and use, improving waste management, and preventing plastic from entering waterways. Every piece of plastic removed from the ocean is one less threat to reefs, but stopping the flow at its source is essential for long-term protection. Can sunscreen really damage coral? Here's a surprising connection between beachgoers and reef health. Yes, some common sunscreen ingredients are harmful to corals, even in tiny concentrations. The main culprits are oxybenzone and octinoxate, UV filtering chemicals found in many sunscreens. Laboratory studies show these chemicals cause coral bleaching by disrupting the coral algae symbiosis, even at concentrations as low as a few parts per trillion, equivalent to a drop of water in multiple Olympic swimming pools. They also interfere with coral reproduction and development, causing deformities in coral larvae and preventing successful settlement. The chemicals act as endocrine disruptors, affecting hormone systems in corals and other reef organisms. They can also exacerbate coral bleaching during temperature stress. How does sunscreen reach reefs? Swimmers wearing sunscreen release it into the water. Up to 25% of applied sunscreen washes off within 20 minutes of swimming. Wastewater from coastal developments contains sunscreen that washed off in showers. In popular tourist areas, the concentration can be significant. One study estimated that annually, thousands of tons of sunscreen enter waters around coral reefs. The good news is that reef-safe alternatives exist. Mineral-based sunscreens using zinc oxide or titanium dioxide don't appear to harm corals and provide effective UV protection. Some locations, Hawaii, Palau, U.S. Virgin Islands, Key West, have banned the sale of sunscreens containing oxybenzone and octinoxate. Tourists can protect both themselves and reefs by choosing reef-safe sunscreen, wearing protective clothing like rash guards, and seeking shade during peak sun hours. It's a small action with measurable impact, particularly in heavily visited reef areas where thousands of swimmers enter the water daily. The sunscreen issue illustrates how individual choices aggregate to ecosystem-level effects and how informed consumers can drive market changes toward less harmful products. How does tourism impact coral ecosystems? Think about the double-edged sword of reef tourism. On one hand, tourism creates economic value for reefs, generating revenue and jobs that motivate local communities and governments to protect reefs. Snorkeling, diving, and glass-bottom boat tours allow millions to experience reef beauty firsthand, creating emotional connections that drive conservation support. Tourism revenue can fund marine protected areas, enforcement, and restoration. On the other hand, tourism causes direct damage when poorly managed. Swimmers and snorkelers standing on or touching coral physically damage fragile structures and transfer diseases. Inexperienced divers kicking coral with fins, bumping into formations, or dragging equipment cause breakage. Boat anchors dropped on reefs destroy corals when hauled up. Boat groundings in shallow water crush vast areas. Diver fins stir up sediment that settles on and smooths corals. The sheer number of visitors concentrates impacts. Popular sites can see thousands of visitors annually, leading to trampling and cumulative damage. Tourism development, hotels, restaurants, docks, increases pollution, sewage, and sediment runoff. Overfishing to supply resort restaurants depletes herbivorous fish. Some tour operators feed fish to attract them for photos, altering natural behavior and potentially spreading disease. Souvenir collection, taking shells, coral, or sea creatures, removes reef components and is often illegal. The solution lies in sustainable tourism practices. Mooring buoys prevent anchor damage. Visitor education reduces harmful behaviors. Limiting visitor numbers to sensitive sites prevents overuse. Marine park fees fund conservation and enforcement. Certification programs train tour operators in best practices. Some locations have implemented highly successful, sustainable tourism models, where well-managed tourism generates conservation funding without causing significant damage. The key is recognizing that reefs are the foundation of the tourism industry, and destroying them destroys the very attraction that brings visitors. Long-term economic success depends on maintaining healthy reefs, creating alignment between business interests and conservation when properly structured. How can divers help protect reefs? Let's focus on the positive role recreational divers can play. Divers are among reefs' most passionate advocates, often becoming conservationists after experiencing reef beauty firsthand. Beyond advocacy, divers can take concrete actions. Practicing good buoyancy control prevents accidental contact with coral. Skilled divers float effortlessly without touching or kicking anything. Securing equipment, gauges, hoses, cameras, prevents dragging across coral. Staying off the bottom and being mindful of fin placement in tight spaces protects fragile structures. Avoiding touching, collecting, or harassing marine life respects ecosystem integrity. Using reef-safe sunscreen eliminates one pollution source. Participating in citizen science programs, divers can collect valuable data, photographing reef conditions, identifying species, monitoring bleaching or disease. These observations, aggregated across thousands of divers, provide scientists with data impossible to gather otherwise. Some programs specifically train volunteer divers to conduct surveys or monitor specific species. Reef cleanup dives remove trash, ghost nets, and debris, directly improving reef health. Divers can report illegal fishing, dynamite fishing, or other harmful activities to authorities. Supporting marine protected areas through park fees and respecting closures allows damaged areas to recover. Choosing dive operators committed to sustainable practices, using mooring buoys, limiting group sizes, providing environmental briefings, rewards responsible businesses. Divers can also support reef conservation organizations through donations or volunteer work. Politically, divers can advocate for stronger environmental regulations, marine protected areas, and climate action. The diving community, millions strong globally, wields significant influence when mobilized. Many conservation success stories began with concerned divers documenting problems and pushing for solutions. By treating reefs with respect, spreading awareness, and actively supporting protection efforts, divers transform from potential threats into powerful allies for reef conservation. Are coral reefs still recovering from human damage? Here's the sobering assessment. Many reefs are not recovering. They're declining, despite conservation efforts, because the pace of damage exceeds the pace of recovery. The Caribbean has lost over 50% of its coral cover since the 1970s. The Great Barrier Reef has lost half its coral in the past 30 years, with recent bleaching events killing additional large areas. Southeast Asian reefs, some of the world's most diverse, have been devastated by blast fishing, pollution, and development. Pacific reefs face similar pressures. Some reefs show localized recovery, where protection is strong. Marine protected areas with enforced fishing restrictions, pollution controls, and active restoration have seen coral cover increase. But these success stories are islands in a sea of decline. The fundamental problem is that recovery requires time measured in decades, while damaging events now occur every few years. Reefs recovering from one bleaching event are hit by another before full recovery. Areas recovering from storms are struck again. Chronic stressors like pollution continuously suppress growth and recovery. The baseline is shifting. What we consider a healthy reef today would have been considered degraded 50 years ago. We're experiencing shifting baseline syndrome, where each generation accepts a more degraded state as normal. Historical records, early photographs, and accounts from elderly fishers describe reefs vastly more abundant and healthy than anything we see now. Some scientists argue we've already lost the window for saving reefs as they existed historically. The question now is whether we can save remnant reef ecosystems in degraded but still functional states, or whether we're heading toward near-complete collapse. The trajectory depends entirely on human actions in the next decade. Whether we aggressively cut emissions, eliminate local stressors, and invest in protection and restoration, or continue business as usual until there's little left to save. Some reefs are recovering, but globally, we're losing ground. The trend line points downward, unless we dramatically change course very soon. What happens if coral reefs disappear completely? Think about cascading consequences. The ecological impacts would be catastrophic. Thousands of species found only in coral reefs would go extinct. Countless others that use reefs as nurseries, feeding grounds, or shelter would decline dramatically. Many commercial fish species would collapse, as their populations depend on reef habitat during vulnerable juvenile stages. Marine food webs would be fundamentally altered, with unpredictable effects rippling through ocean ecosystems. Biodiversity loss would be comparable to clearing all tropical rainforests. Economically, coastal communities depending on reef fisheries would face food insecurity and loss of livelihoods. Hundreds of millions of people rely on reef fish as their primary protein source. Remove reefs, and you remove their food security. Tourism economies in tropical nations would collapse, eliminating billions of dollars in revenue and millions of jobs. Coastal property would become far more vulnerable to storms and erosion. Without reefs buffering waves, many coastlines would erode rapidly, beaches would disappear, and property damage from storms would increase dramatically. Insurance costs would skyrocket for coastal properties. Many low-lying islands would become uninhabitable, creating climate refugees forced to relocate. The cost of building and maintaining artificial coastal protection, seawalls, breakwaters, beach nourishment, would run into hundreds of billions of dollars globally. Medically, we'd lose potential pharmaceutical discoveries. Many promising drugs have been derived from reef organisms, and losing reefs means losing these natural pharmaceutical libraries before we've fully explored them. Culturally, indigenous peoples with deep connections to reefs would lose essential parts of their heritage and identity. Spiritually and aesthetically, humanity would lose one of nature's most beautiful and inspiring creations. The loss would impoverish human experience, eliminating places of wonder that have inspired art, literature, and scientific discovery. Future generations would grow up in a world where coral reefs exist only in archives and museums, like passenger pigeons or dodos, extinct wonders that previous generations failed to protect. Could we survive without coral reefs? Let's be clear about the stakes. Humanity as a species would survive reef loss. We're adaptable. We have alternatives to reef-dependent resources. And most of the global population lives far from reefs. But survival isn't the standard we should aspire to. Hundreds of millions of people would suffer enormously. Small island nations might become uninhabitable, forcing mass migrations. Coastal communities would lose livelihoods spanning generations. Food insecurity would increase in regions already facing malnutrition. The economic disruption would cost trillions of dollars globally. Beyond immediate human impacts, losing reefs would represent a massive ecosystem collapse, destabilizing marine food webs and ocean health generally. Oceans regulate global climate and produce much of our oxygen. Degraded oceans perform these services less effectively. Losing reefs is part of a broader pattern of biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation that threatens planetary life support systems. We're conducting an uncontrolled experiment with Earth's ecosystems, removing critical components and hoping the system doesn't collapse. Reefs are canaries in the coal mine, early warning systems showing us that ocean conditions are deteriorating. If we lose reefs, what's next? When do other ecosystems reach their tipping points? The interconnectedness of Earth's systems means that seemingly distant ecosystem collapses eventually affect everyone. Moreover, the question isn't really about physical survival, but about the world we want to live in. Do we want a planet with vibrant, diverse ecosystems, or one where natural beauty has been reduced to remnants in protected areas? Do we want future generations to experience the wonder of coral reefs, or to look at museum dioramas and ask why we didn't save them when we had the chance? We can survive without coral reefs, but at tremendous cost: economic, ecological, and spiritual. The better question is why we would choose to. How do coral reefs contribute to human medicine? Here's a remarkable but often overlooked reef value. Reef organisms produce complex chemical compounds as defenses against predators, competitors, and diseases. These compounds are potential sources of new medicines, and several important drugs have already been derived from reef species. AZT, one of the first drugs used to treat HIV, was developed from compounds originally extracted from a Caribbean sponge, pseudopterosin, a powerful anti-inflammatory agent now used in skincare products. Comes from sea whips, soft corals common on reefs. Conotoxins, from cone snails, include some of the most potent and specific neurotoxins known, and one, seconotide, is now used as a powerful painkiller for chronic pain, particularly in cancer patients. It's more effective than morphine and non-addictive. Compounds from reef organisms show promise against cancer. Several are in clinical trials. Briostins, from bryozoans, are being tested for treating cancer and Alzheimer's disease. Compounds from sea squirts and tunicates are being developed as anti-cancer agents. Reef organisms produce antibiotics effective against drug-resistant bacteria, a critical need as antibiotic resistance spreads. Some coral compounds have antiviral properties, Others show potential for treating inflammatory diseases, cardiovascular conditions, and neurological disorders. The diversity of reef life represents millions of years of evolutionary experimentation in biochemistry. Each species has evolved unique compounds for specific purposes, creating a vast natural pharmaceutical library. We've barely begun to explore this resource. Most reef species have never been chemically analyzed. Each species we lose is a lost library, potential cures forever unavailable. The economic value is staggering. Pharmaceuticals derived from marine organisms are worth billions of dollars annually, with potential for much more. Protecting reefs isn't just about preserving beauty or ecosystems. It's about maintaining a resource that could provide cures for diseases affecting millions. Every species that goes extinct before we study it might have contained the cure for cancer, Alzheimer's, or the next pandemic. Are scientists discovering cures hidden in reefs? Think about the ongoing exploration of reef pharmacy. Marine biochemistry is a rapidly growing field, with researchers systematically collecting and analyzing reef organisms for bioactive compounds. The process is painstaking, collecting samples carefully to avoid harming reefs, isolating individual chemical compounds, testing them for biological activity, determining their structures, synthesizing them in labs, and conducting trials to develop medicines. Each step takes years, but the payoff can be enormous. Recent discoveries include compounds from sea fans that show promise against inflammation and pain. Pseudoturicins reduce swelling and speed wound healing. They're already in skincare products and being tested for medical applications. Compounds from reef bryozoans are being developed for treating memory disorders. Some soft coral compounds show activity against malaria parasites. Sea cucumber compounds have anti-tumor properties. Cone snail venom is a treasure trove. Each cone snail species produces hundreds of unique peptides, each targeting specific molecular receptors with extraordinary precision. Scientists are working through these systematically, identifying ones with medical potential. Some might become the next generation of painkillers, muscle relaxants, or neurological medications. Marine sponges are particularly rich sources. They can't run away from predators and produce powerful chemical defenses. Many sponge compounds have anti-cancer activity. Technology is accelerating discovery. Genetic sequencing reveals the genes responsible for producing interesting compounds, allowing scientists to synthesize them in bacteria or yeast rather than harvesting from reefs. Computer modeling predicts which compounds might have specific activities, guiding research priorities. But discovery depends on biodiversity. We need living reefs with full species complements. As reefs degrade, we're losing species before we can study them. It's a race against time, attempting to catalog and understand reef biochemistry before the organisms disappear. The irony is bitter. We're destroying reefs just as we're discovering how medically valuable they are, eliminating potential cures through the same neglect that makes us need those cures. How much of our oxygen comes from coral ecosystems? Let's clarify a common misconception. While coral reefs are incredibly important, they don't directly produce a large fraction of Earth's oxygen. The primary oxygen producers in oceans are phytoplankton, microscopic algae, drifting in open water, particularly in cold, nutrient-rich areas. These tiny organisms produce roughly 50 to 80% of Earth's oxygen, with terrestrial plants producing the rest. Coral reefs, covering less than 1% of ocean area, contribute only a small fraction of total oxygen production, probably less than 1%. However, reefs play important indirect roles in marine productivity. Reefs concentrate nutrients and create upwelling currents that enhance phytoplankton growth in surrounding waters. Reef organisms consume and recycle nutrients efficiently, supporting broader marine food webs that depend ultimately on phytoplankton. Many commercial fish species use reefs as nurseries. These fish, when mature, range widely and contribute to open ocean food webs. Reefs are nodes in larger ocean ecosystems, and their health affects the productivity of much larger areas. The zooxanthellae in corals do photosynthesize and produce oxygen, but the scale is small compared to open ocean phytoplankton. The real value of reefs isn't their oxygen production, it's their biodiversity, coastal protection, and support for marine food webs. That said, the health of ocean ecosystems generally, including both reefs and open water, is critical for maintaining oxygen production. Degraded oceans produce less oxygen. Dead zones, areas of low oxygen caused by pollution, are expanding. Climate change is warming and stratifying oceans, reducing nutrient availability for phytoplankton. Protecting reefs is part of protecting overall ocean health, which in turn maintains the ocean's role in oxygen production and carbon cycling. So while reefs themselves aren't Earth's lungs, healthy reefs indicate healthy oceans, and healthy oceans are essential for the oxygen we breathe and the climate we depend on. What is the economic value of coral reefs? Here's where we quantify what reefs provide. Economists have attempted to calculate the total economic value of coral reef ecosystem services, and the numbers are staggering. Global estimates suggest coral reefs provide benefits worth $375 billion to $2.7 trillion annually, depending on methodology and what factors are included. Fisheries value is significant. Reefs support commercial and subsistence. Fisheries worth billions annually, providing protein for millions of people and livelihoods for millions more. Tourism and recreation generate tens of billions of dollars yearly from diving, snorkeling, and reef-associated activities, supporting local economies in tropical nations. Coastal protection services. The value of wave reduction, storm buffering, and erosion prevention are estimated at hundreds of billions annually, representing what it would cost to build and maintain artificial structures, providing equivalent protection. Biodiversity and pharmaceutical potential have economic value that's harder to quantify, but potentially enormous if reef-derived drugs are developed. Cultural and aesthetic values, while difficult to monetize, are real. People value knowing reefs exist, even if they never visit one. This existence value shows up in willingness to donate to conservation or support protective policies. Per unit area, coral reefs are among the most economically valuable ecosystems on Earth, generating far more economic activity than equivalent areas of ocean, farmland, or forest. The economic argument for reef conservation is clear. Protecting reefs is economically rational. Reef degradation represents massive economic losses, yet the economic benefits often accrue locally or diffusely, while the costs of protection are concentrated and immediate, creating political challenges. Additionally, many reef values aren't captured by markets. Fishers don't pay corals for providing habitat. Tourists don't compensate reefs for beauty, and no one bills the ocean for oxygen. These market failures mean reef values are underpriced, leading to overexploitation and neglect. Including reef ecosystem services and economic calculations and policy decisions. Through marine protected areas, conservation investments and regulations, limiting harmful activities helps align economic incentives with ecological realities. What are coral nurseries? Think about farming corals to restore damaged reefs. Coral nurseries are underwater facilities where corals are grown from small fragments before being transplanted onto degraded reefs. The process typically starts with fragments broken from healthy coral colonies, either naturally broken pieces or carefully harvested samples. These fragments are attached to nursery structures, frames, ropes, tables, or trees made from PVC or other materials, where they grow for several months to a few years until they reach transplantable size. During this time, nursery workers clean the fragments of algae and predators, monitor growth, and provide care. Once large enough, the corals are carefully removed and transplanted onto reef restoration sites, where they're secured with marine epoxy or cement. Over time, these transplants grow, reproduce, and ideally establish self-sustaining populations. Coral nurseries can produce thousands of corals annually, though the scale is still tiny compared to the massive areas of degraded reef. The approach works best with fast-growing species like staghorn and elkhorn coral, which can grow from finger-sized fragments to basketball-sized colonies in a few years. Massive, slow-growing species are less suitable for nursery production due to their growth rates. Success rates vary. Some transplants die from stress, disease, or predation, while others thrive. Well-managed programs report survival rates of 70 to 90% for transplants. The technique is spreading globally, with coral nurseries now operating in dozens of countries. Some programs engage local communities, creating jobs and building local investment in reef health. Others involve volunteers, allowing tourists and citizens to participate in restoration. While nurseries can't restore reefs at the scale needed to offset widespread damage, they're valuable tools for rebuilding specific damaged sites, especially in marine protected areas where other threats are controlled. They also provide education and hope, showing that active restoration is possible and engaging people directly in conservation. Can scientists grow new reefs in labs? Let's explore the cutting edge of coral science. Scientists are developing techniques to culture corals entirely in laboratories, controlling conditions to maximize growth and survival. Laboratory coral culture allows researchers to grow corals much faster than in the ocean by optimizing temperature, light, water flow, and nutrients. Some fast-growing species can be grown from larvae to reproductive size in less than a year under ideal conditions, compared to several years in nature. This rapid growth enables production of large numbers of corals for research and restoration. Labs can also experiment with techniques to improve coral resilience. Some researchers are deliberately stressing corals, exposing them to higher temperatures, and selecting individuals that survive, then breeding these heat-tolerant corals to create more resilient strains. This assisted evolution, or selective breeding approach, aims to help corals adapt faster than natural selection alone would allow. Other techniques include manipulating the zooxanthellae symbionts, introducing coral species to more heat-tolerant algae strains, or shuffling the algae communities within corals to favor robust types. Genetic approaches are being explored, identifying genes associated with stress tolerance and potentially using selective breeding or even genetic modification to enhance coral resilience. Cryopreservation, freezing coral sperm, eggs, and larvae, is being developed to preserve genetic diversity, creating frozen zoos of coral genetics that could be used for restoration even if wild populations go extinct. Lab-grown corals can be used for research without damaging wild reefs, allowing scientists to study coral biology, test restoration techniques, and develop stress-tolerant strains. However, lab techniques are expensive and can't yet operate at scales sufficient to restore major reef areas. They're tools in the conservation toolkit, not silver bullets. The real solution remains addressing root causes: climate change, pollution, overfishing. Lab techniques can help reefs survive while we solve bigger problems, but they can't replace healthy ocean conditions. How do coral fragments become new colonies? Here's the biological process underlying coral restoration. Coral fragmentation is natural. Storms break coral branches, which sometimes survive and grow into new colonies, a form of asexual reproduction. Restoration harnesses this natural process. When a coral fragment is broken from a colony, the polyps at the broken edges heal, growing new tissue over exposed skeleton. If the fragment lands on suitable substrate, the polyps at the base secrete new skeleton, attaching the fragment to the surface. Once attached, the fragment grows through asexual reproduction. Each polyp buds new polyps. The colony expands, adding to its skeleton continuously. Under good conditions, a palm-sized fragment can grow into a large colony within a few years. The key is giving fragments the right conditions: stable attachment, so waves don't dislodge them; clean water, so algae don't smother them; protection from predators during vulnerable early growth; and optimal temperature and light for the zooxanthellae to photosynthesize efficiently. In coral nurseries, fragments are given ideal conditions: and protected until they're large enough to withstand typical reef stresses. When transplanted to restoration sites, they need continued monitoring. Initially, cleaning away algae, removing predators, reattaching if dislodged, until they're established. Success depends on the fragment's health, the quality of care, and whether the restoration site has suitable conditions. If chronic stresses like pollution or warming remain unaddressed, even well-grown transplants will struggle. This is why restoration works best in protected areas where other threats are controlled. The fragments themselves are genetically identical to their parent colonies. They're clones. For genetic diversity, restoration programs use fragments from multiple parent colonies, creating genetic diversity at the restoration site, even though individual colonies are clones. Sexual reproduction eventually adds more diversity as the transplanted corals mature and spawn, mixing genes with each other and with nearby wild corals. What is coral gardening? Think about actively cultivating corals, like farmers cultivate crops. Coral gardening is the practice of growing corals in nurseries, the garden, and transplanting them onto reefs to restore degraded areas. The term emphasizes the agricultural approach, careful tending, selective cultivation, and intentional planting to achieve restoration goals. Coral gardeners perform tasks analogous to terrestrial gardening. They propagate corals by taking cuttings, fragments, nurture young corals in protected nurseries, weed out algae, and remove pests, and eventually harvest and plant mature corals onto reefs. The approach requires regular maintenance. Nursery structures must be cleaned, algae scrubbed from corals, predators removed, and damaged fragments repaired or replaced. It's labor-intensive, requiring frequent dives and considerable expertise, but it works. Programs like the Coral Restoration Foundation in Florida have planted hundreds of thousands of corals, rebuilding areas of reef that were reduced to rubble. Coral gardening creates measurable results. Restored sites show increased coral cover, returning fish and invertebrates, and improved reef structure. It also engages communities. Local people become invested in restored reefs they helped plant, creating stewardship and protection. Some programs train fishers as coral gardeners, providing alternative livelihoods while rebuilding the ecosystems that sustain traditional fishing. Tourist resorts adopt coral nurseries, allowing guests to participate in restoration, creating awareness and funding. Coral gardening is scalable. Small operations can restore localized damage, while larger programs aim to restore extensive areas. However, it's expensive and can't outpace widespread degradation from climate change and other threats. It's most effective as part of comprehensive reef management that addresses root causes while actively rebuilding damaged areas. Coral gardening offers hope and agency, concrete actions people can take to help reefs, but it must be paired with larger-scale efforts to stabilize ocean conditions.